Hi everybody, it's Mike. As you know by now, I'm one of the admins of the Moon Landing Hoax Facebook group. And today I want to do a very quick live stream to chat with you a little bit today and to talk about why the moon landing lie is a wicked one. Now, many of you are familiar with Bart Sibrel, the famous moon landing hoax researcher who published A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon back in 2001 and published that famous Apollo footage of the fakery from the Apollo 11 crew. You're of course all aware of that. But in Bart Sibrel's numerous interviews, he makes an analogy that I find very useful in regards to the moon landing lie. And he refers to the moon landing lie as wicked. And, you know, I don't know if this is true or not. I tried to look up the etymology to the word wicked. But when Bart Sibrel mentions the word wicked in conjunction with the moon landing lie, he references that the origins of the word basically come from the wick of a candle. So you have two wicks twisted together. And when we refer to something as wicked, one wick of the candle twisted together is referred to as the truth, and the other wick twisting together is the lie. So a wicked lie is when we take the truth and the lie and we blend them together, and the reason we do that is to make the lie less obvious, less discernible, and more likely for us to get away with the lie, right? So think of this, you know, if you are, cheating on a spouse, for example, would it be easier for you, if your spouse confronts you on the matter later on, to lie and say you went somewhere completely different, like you went to the grocery store, when it's very easy to determine that you were over at the woman's house or the man's house if you're a woman, I guess? Or would it be easier to say, well, I went to that person's house to pick up X, Y, and Z item, chatted with them for a little bit, but I didn't actually cheat on my spouse, but I was there, right? So the smart person that is contemptibly evil, I guess we would say in this scenario, would be somebody that would blend as much of the truth as possible with the lie in order to get away with it, right? And he uses that analogy exactly with NASA, the NSA, National Security Agency, in conjunction with NASA, in regards to how the Apollo moon landings were faked, okay? So in regards to that, the idea is that you try and do as much as you can legitimately with the Apollo program. You don't fake everything like these flat earthers who come into our group and like to claim that everything is fake, space is fake, the rockets are fake, they're just balloons, and there's people that spout that kind of nonsense, and that just discredits us, right? A true wicked lie is going to take as much of the truth as possible and blend it with the lie in order to get away with it, okay? So obviously there was a real Apollo rocket called the Saturn V rocket that went into space. They legitimately built a lander that allegedly landed on the moon. Now, it didn't land on the moon, of course, but they definitely built all of the hardware in order to ostensibly land on the moon, okay? And they hired, what does NASA like to tell us, 400,000 contractors, at least so they claim, in all 50 states around the country, I mean to say. And of course, the reason that's done is you compartmentalize the program. So I think it was Playtex made the material for the astronaut spacesuits. That would be a large contractor, and then little tiny contractors all throughout all 50 states would work on the Apollo program and all do their little bits and pieces. And then what they would do, of course, is they would go home to their wives and children and their family at parties, and they would proudly say, you know, I worked on the Apollo program. I'm proud of that. Look at what I did. And of course, you know, decades into the future, all those, children that are now adults now can all talk about how they had an uncle, a grandfather, a father, a cousin, whoever it was, right? And I know the moon landings were real because my so-and-so family member or friend worked on Apollo. And they all gave them a bunch of busy work, little details that probably didn't amount to much. And of course, if you read these trolls that come into our group that say, well, 400,000 people worked on the moon mission, they couldn't have all lied, so therefore, the Apollo missions must be real, right? Well, nonsense, right? It's called compartmentalization. They give them all a little bit of something to do, right? And they're genuine things, right? So somebody worked on a genuine part of the rubber for the overshoe for the Apollo astronaut boot. Somebody worked for the hoses, for the propellant system, for the hypergolic rocket engines. And a lot of these parts and pieces were legitimate. Of course, when we blend all those pieces together to create the mission that purportedly took men to the moon, well, we know that didn't happen when we look at the photographic and video records, especially the records that Bart Serbel published and released in 2001 that we're aware of. And we don't even need to look at the video records. We can look at the photographic records and know clearly these photos weren't taken on the moon. Clearly the video wasn't taken on the moon, but nonetheless, these 400,000 people working for various contractors all throughout the country, and of course, all 50 states, right? They wanted to make sure every state, every community had some contractor that worked on Apollo so that people could say in the future, yes, the moon landings were real because my great uncle or whoever worked on the Apollo program. Okay, so the idea behind the wicked lie, remember the wick of the candle twisting together the truth and the lie together, is we blend as much of the truth as possible with the lie in order to get away with as much as possible, okay? So you don't want to lie unnecessarily. And NASA didn't lie unnecessarily, right? They legitimately built a Saturn V rocket that took astronauts into low Earth orbit, okay? They legitimately sent robotic probes to the moon on a routine basis in the 1960s, okay? And of course, you can send a robotic probe to the moon to put retro reflectors on it. Possibly you can send a probe to the moon and take back rocks and samples, but we know what they didn't do is actually land men on the moon. And why? Well, the leading theory that we push forward in our group, of course, has to do with the radiation. So two things, flares from the sun, solar flares as we call them, and the radiation generally coming from the sun. And then the other thing being the exploding stars, the supernovas as we call them, producing galactic cosmic rays. So solar rays and galactic cosmic rays project these heavy radiation, these particles accelerating through the universe, and they come to the Earth. And when they come to the Earth, we have an iron core which projects a magnetic field. The magnetic field around the Earth traps that radiation, and that is why we here on Earth can survive and not be killed by all this galactic cosmic radiation. Once we get beyond that projected iron core around the Earth that protects us, which is about 1,000 miles or so up, is when we start getting to the point where all of that radiation is trapped. Once we get beyond that region, we call that region, by the way, the Van Allen belts, named after Dr. Van Allen, who discovered the belts in the 1950s and published a paper stating that there is no way humans can survive travel through this region of space, because he put detectors on craft, light craft going into high Earth orbit, and when the Geiger counters were detecting this radiation, it went off the charts. And that's when they determined that space would be too deadly beyond low Earth orbit. Now remember, the International Space Station is about 200 miles, a little higher than that, up in low Earth orbit. So about the, distance roughly from maybe Boston to New York or something like that. Which isn't very high when you think about it. It's only 200 miles up, low Earth orbit. It orbits the Earth. And sending robotic probes, beyond low Earth orbit is, technically feasible, and that is done on a routine basis since the early 1960s. The problem is sending flesh and blood, particularly human flesh and blood, Certain animals like turtles can handle radiation, which is why you see some of our trolls in our group say, of course, well, they sent trolls outside, not trolls, excuse me, trolls say they sent turtles outside low Earth orbit, so therefore, humans can survive. Well, not true, right? Turtles can absorb quite a bit more radiation than human beings can, and that may have been where we got the notion in the 1980s, that comic book, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Because turtles are known for being able to absorb a lot of radiation, right? So anyway, so human beings, cannot survive the deadly radiation beyond low Earth orbit, and that's the reason they can't send human beings to the moon. However, robotic craft can travel beyond low Earth orbit, so there we can place maybe retroreflectors on the moon to kind of, and people will turn around and say, or at least our trolls will in our group, and say, well, this is proof that men landed on the moon. No, it isn't. It's just proof that a robotic probe landed on there. And they'll say, well, we have rocks that came from the moon. Well, you can check out my podcast, or a live stream, I guess as we would call it, number 4 in the group. Just look up MLH live stream number 4, and I go into how the rocks are certainly not proof that men, use their pressurized gloves to pick them up those rocks, travel in a craft, and take them back to Earth. Because clearly robotic probes can be sent to the moon to take back rocks, and then also certain rocks fall from the orbit of the Earth that came from the moon millions and millions of years ago. For some reason, ostensibly they land in Antarctica, the South Pole, and Wernher von Braun, one of the chief architects of the Apollo program, took an expedition right before the Apollo missions going to the moon were launched, in order to get the moon rocks from the South Pole, in order to actually compare them to the moon rocks that they ostensibly were going to bring back to show that they're genuine. So nonetheless, I think one of the faults that we have in our community with the moon landing hoax is there's this temptation for a lot of people to go from, well, Apollo was faked, therefore the International Space Station is faked, therefore the Mars missions were faked, therefore all space travel is fake, right? And we definitely do not go that far in this group. I think the important thing to take away is to, circling back to the main point of this live stream, I want to get this point across very strongly, is that when you lie, and you want to commit to what we call a wicked lie, just like Bart Sabrell has mentioned in his numerous podcasts he's done, He talks about the etymology of the word wicked. We have the lie and the truth, and we have two wicks of a candle twisted together. You want to twist as much of the truth as possible with the lie in order to get away with it. Because what happens commonly in our group has a ton of fantastic evidence that we promote on a daily basis in this group. Namely, for example, we have pictures, or video rather, from Apollo 14 of the astronauts inside the lunar module. They're not touching the flag. Nonetheless, we can see the flag in frames to the far right of the camera, and we can see it blowing back and forth. Clearly not possible in a vacuum environment on the moon. Then we have other video footage of Apollo 15 where the astronauts are tossing a cord or cable, and then it bounces and makes a noise off as it bounces off of the lunar module. Well, again, there should be no sound in space. It's technically impossible for any sound to be made, especially when we're throwing a cord and it bounces off the lunar module. Now, there's lots of sounds, actually, you can see in the video record for Apollo. They're banging a cord tube down into the soil on the moon with a hammer, and it's bang, bang, bang. They're banging away, right? And that makes a sound. And NASA's official excuse was, of course, well, the sound must have reverberated through the suit. Well, okay, well, if that's true, well, why is it still making a sound when they're clearly throwing a cord and it's bouncing off the lunar module? Boom, you have a sound, right? The Apollo photography, as I've done live streams on, you can check out live stream number 2. Beyond any reasonable doubt, that photography is faked, right? You've got shadows pointing perpendicular to each other, right? Our trolls like to say, well, it's like how train tracks converge to a point, right? Therefore, the Apollo photography that has shadows that are kind of pointing toward each other, well, it's just like when you look at train tracks and they converge to a point, to a horizon. Therefore, the Apollo photography is legitimate. Well, no. The Apollo shadows will be pointing this way on one side of one photo, and then in the far background they're pointing this way. So you've got shadows on opposite ends pointing toward each other, and then you've got photos of the astronaut with the camera pointed toward the ground, which eliminates the whole shadows converging toward a horizon argument you can make, and the shadows are going perpendicular 90 degrees toward each other. Only possible with a studio lighting, close proximity light source. You don't get that type of lighting with sunlight, because the sun is many, many times larger than the Earth, and it's many, many more millions of miles away, 90 million miles away plus, and much bigger than the Earth. Therefore, you have parallel shadows. And they'll still be parallel even if we were to look at shadows converging toward a horizon, right? Because that's just an issue of perspective. And our trolls like to say, well, it's just perspective, it's all perspective. Well, no, right? When they're going like this toward each other, maybe that's perspective, but it sure ain't perspective when they're going perpendicular to each other, and it sure as hell ain't perspective when they're pointing toward each other, right? So we have all types of evidence like that the manned aspect of the Apollo program was faked. But I think what happens is we like to assume, well, the lie must have not stopped there, and it must have gone much, much further, and that therefore, the ISS and all these other things were faked. Well, we don't have the incredible evidence that the ISS was faked, International Space Station, and the Mars missions and all that. You can nitpick at a couple little details of it that may be of question, but certainly the evidence is not nearly at the same level as the evidence that we have that the Apollo missions purporting to send men to the moon were faked. Anyway, that's about all today. This is my 6th live stream. I'll end it here, and then maybe I'll do a 7th one later. I hope you guys are having a great evening and a great weekend coming up here, and I'll see you again real soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.